All right, I'm glad to be here today. It's fun to see some familiar faces, and I'm glad to be able to present to you. I hope that I've aligned this in a way that is meaningful to you. The field of user experience design is so broad and covers so many areas that it's sometimes difficult to decide who we are and that sort of thing. So as I go through this, I'm going to try to make the presentation about a half an hour long, and then open it up to do a little exercise, and then answer questions and talk about design in general. I put this quote up here just because it's sort of the core of what I believe in terms of design. My background is actually in journalism. I did a communications degree and worked for a newspaper for about 5 years before coming back to school, doing a master's in recreation and then a PhD in IP&T. But this idea of we can add things all the time. We can add features, we can add words, we can multiply and build things that are complex pretty easily. But really distilling something down and making it the simplest form that's still meaningful and still useful is the core of what I think it makes for really great design. So sometimes you'll see this quote attributed to Albert Einstein. I did some pretty thorough research that this is not Albert Einstein's quote. It's actually Schumacher. But that's just a little introduction. So I'm the director of UX at Rain. And we're a software agency dealing with companies around the world, trying to help develop mobile applications, websites, and other designs in the software space on behalf of clients. So usually they come to us with their specs or what they want built, and we're a pretty strong software group of developers. We have about 50 developers, and so they can take the specs and say what they want with them. Okay, Jay, there's some seats up here. But what I'd love to do as a UX designer is when we get the chance, we go in at the strategy level and people say, this is the kind of thing that we want to accomplish. And we do some initial research with people, interviews and observation, and try to understand them so that then we can create something better for the client than they perhaps are able to think of themselves. So we actually have a division between visual design and user experience design, which is sometimes an anomaly. A lot of times it's all lumped together under interaction design. But we on the UX side, really stay at that level where we're trying to understand what the best flow for a user is through the process, understanding the organization of a website. That's information architecture stuff. And then we have our visual designers that we work with closely to try to give it a really nice sheen. And we have some really talented designers in our office, and I wouldn't claim to be anywhere near the ability that they have to make something look nice. But I think I have a better ability than most of them to make things functional and usable. So that's me as a UX designer in general. Communication to guide behavior is what I feel like user experience design is. And it's in parallel with a lot of what we think about as instructional design. Some of what instructional designers are asked to do delves deeply into many of the subfields of user experience design. But for me, the essence of user experience design is communication that guides behavior, and in many ways, instruction is meant to do the same thing. We're communicating to people to help them change their attitudes, opinions, behaviors, or just concepts around specific situations, the ability to respond to those situations. User experiences, as I mentioned, the term is used to cover a blanket of lots of areas. And there's a guy by the name of Peter Marble who's an information architect, and he was sort of delving into the ideas of user experience, and he created this graphic that I thought was pretty nice. It's summing up what our objectives are in user experience design. I'm just going to briefly go through each of these areas. Because user experience is sort of an outgrowth of the human-computer interaction field that started many, many years ago. And that field is really paying attention to how people interact with computers. So that observational side, understanding what that relationship is and how they interface. So our objective as user experience designers and researchers, interaction designers, is to identify customer pain points and obstacles in a given workflow or process, and then tell a compelling story about those problems and obstacles and the risks, and then provide some recommendations for alleviating those risks. Interaction design is basically about making things usable. So those things get in the way. The findability is the idea of information architecture, where you're taking a vast amount of information and structuring it in a way that when people approach it, they don't have to think too deeply about it in order to get what they need, the information out of the site. A lot of times information architects are thought of as librarians of the internet, just trying to make things findable. Credibility is an important aspect, especially for instructional designers. There's an emerging field over the last probably about a decade called persuasive design, and it's the idea about making things influential, and credibility is a big part about that. It's a key component of persuasive design, where if we create something and people don't believe what it says, and then you lose credibility, you lose your ability to persuade and to change people's thoughts. Accessibility, there's two aspects of this from my perspective. One is the idea of making anything that you create able to be used by people who have disabilities. Making a website able to be read easily by a screen reader, and then being able to speak those things for someone who is hard of sight. Dealing with color blindness is often an issue where if you do a red and a green next to each other, you can't differentiate, and so you lose some of the meaning of the site. Thinking about those things is one aspect of accessibility, and then currently the trend of multiple screen sizes and mobile devices and everything. Accessibility on all of those devices is an important aspect of instructional or of user experience design now. And one of the buzzwords right now is responsive design, where you're creating a website that will change size based on the person changing the size of their screen, or whenever they open their device, it's designed specifically for that device size. Desirability, usefulness, and valuable are things that are really overlapping for me. But desirability comes from responding to user goals. That's where you're setting up your design based on actually seeing people's needs and then designing based on that. It's also hints at the aesthetic value of the site or the application, where when you create something, people don't want to have to come and mess around and be kind of faced with ugliness. I guess that's the point. You want to create something that people want to come to. There's another chair right up front here. And this also takes into consideration content strategy, the idea of designing around content specifically, which is another thing that instructional design is very heavily, I think, weighted towards, is you want to take your content and then fit the design around it, understanding that content and what users need. Just basically it's this focus that we should let me, hey Richard, there's a chair over here too.
Oh, we're
Big hit, Christjian.
What's that?
Big hit.
Yeah.
Lots of people want to come see.
Flattered. So our design should be basically aligned to make sure that they match their users' desires. Content strategy and usability combined here in this idea of useful to result in a product that the user finds helpful in their daily experience. And I think that's one of the important things about what we do is when we create instructional design, it should not be a burden to people. And sometimes when we create interfaces and people, I don't know if you guys remember Blackboard. I used Blackboard as an instructor here when I was teaching some classes, and it was a burden to me. I loved that my students would be able to see their grades, so I like to enter them for them. But it was a big burden for me to have to go in and enter all that information. I don't know if the system they have now, I haven't used it, if it's any better. But the objective should be make it useful. Lastly, valuable. what Peter Morville said is, our sites must deliver value to our sponsors. For nonprofits, the user experience must advance the mission. With for-profits, it must contribute to the bottom line and improve customer satisfaction. So overall, experience design, this whole user experience idea is the idea of making things seamless. Taking into context where a person lives, not just the mouse click to screen interface, but actually considering the context in which the system will be used and making sure that it flows into a person's work overall. And all of these areas and the progression down that line, so from human-computer interaction down through information architecture and then to persuasive design and so on, it goes into sort of deeper meanings and bigger impacts, like the Krippendorf trajectory that if you've taken Dr. Gibbons' class or read Krippendorf, sort of that idea of becoming a more meaningful design interaction, actually changing people's lives, allowing richer interaction. So I want to go back and talk about usability as one aspect here. I think of dividing user experience in two categories. One is the do no harm category, and the other one is create delight. So for the do no harm, as user experience researchers, like I said, our objective was to identify pain points and to design in such a way that people don't have to think about what they're doing necessarily, to eliminate unnecessary thinking, I'll put it that way. So one of the ways that I think most designers of any field that has to deal with software should think about are these design usability heuristics, which were developed by Jacob Nielsen of the Nielsen-Norman Group. He did some research on a lot of usability studies and came up with these 10 distilled points. He had an earlier iteration and then did some more research and came up with this final list. And each of these are a way of designing with the user in mind to prevent them. So I'm just going to read through each of these and give an example that I can think of, and then we'll be done with the heuristics. But this says that the system should always keep users informed about what is going on through appropriate feedback within reasonable time. So the spinning wheel of death is usually the type of feedback that they're talking about. You click something, you see the spinning wheel, so you know that the computer is doing something. Or a progress bar, if you download something, then on Google Chrome, for instance, it starts that wheel to show you how the progress of the download. On the BYU financial site, which is actually much better than it used to be, but I went on it last night because I was going to get a bad example, but they've improved things a little bit. But then I clicked on one of the buttons, and nothing happened. So I looked around the screen, because I was thinking, top of mind, where's my visibility of status? And up in the upper right-hand corner in a little box about this big, there's a little spinning wheel. So, my eye was trained here. So the idea, if you're going to create a wheel like that, is to make it prominent and show so people understand that something's happening in the system. It gives people a feeling of peace rather than anxiety. Yes.
Does this also include knowing where they are?
Sorry.
Let's say
Oh, like in the navigation understanding.
So you're in this whole big website. Is that you want to anchor them to know where they are? And your point is more about the loading type stuff you're talking about.
that's part of it. I'm trying to think if any of these others apply, but yeah, understanding where you are in the system, I think, would fall into that. Yeah, making sure if there's breadcrumbs, for example, to help people know how they got to where they were, or if they come into the system not knowing. The match between system and the real world. The system should speak the user's language with words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user, rather than system-oriented terms. Follow real-world conventions, making information appear in a natural and logical order. Come on in, there's seats up front.
I'm not sure I want to sit there.
There's a thing called skeuomorphism, which is a lot of Apple's products that they create actually look like the calendar looks like a calendar. And that, taking that metaphor a little to the extreme, can limit your ability to design well with the tools that are available to you, but at least helping create a parallel between what the user experienced in everyday life and what they're seeing on the screen is helpful to ease their cognitive load. user control and freedom. Users often choose system functions by mistake and will need clearly marked emergency exit to leave the unwanted state without having to go through an extended dialogue. Support undo and redo. Users should not have to wonder whether different words, situations, or actions mean the same thing. Just follow platform conventions. This is something that I think, as designers, we sometimes will want to be creative, and so we want to do something different from what's been done before. But often, because we haven't thought through the process, or we're getting something strange, even if it might be good, in some respects, it's not good enough that it's worth doing instead of just doing what's the convention. That's a judgment call a lot of times, but consistency helps with user experience. Even better than good error messages is a careful design which prevents a problem from occurring in the first place. Either eliminate error-prone conditions or check for them and present users with a confirmation option before they commit to the action. This is something like, do you really want to close this without saving? That used to happen all the time until someone said, hey, let's give them a warning so they don't erase all the hard work. And then, as a progression of that, autosave on the internet is becoming more prevalent, where you don't even have to push save. In Google Docs, it's all saved automatically for you. So that's sort of a progression of making it easier for the user. Recognition rather than recall. Minimize the user's memory load by making objects, actions, and options visible. The user should not have to remember information from one part of the dialogue to another. Instructions for use of the system should be visible or easily retrievable whenever appropriate. For me, this is an important point, just because the cognitive load required to try to hunt something down. Where did I see that control? By making them visible. And so for instance, if any of you have used Adobe tools, Photoshop, Illustrator, there's a lot of controls out on the right-hand side. Some of them, the less used ones, get a little bit more buried, but the frequently used ones are out there, and you can customize it as necessary. That allows you to keep top of mind things, so you don't have to hunt for them. Flexibility and ease of use. Accelerators unseen by the novice user may often speed up the interaction with the expert user, such that the system can cater to both inexperienced and experienced users, allow users to tailor frequent actions. So again, using Adobe Illustrator, I use quick keys all the time to duplicate something. I'll hold Option and I'll drag an object and it duplicates itself, or do quick keys to create a new artboard or anything like that. It's just, as you're an expert, the more you use it, you don't want to have to hunt around for tools. You can just do things with your fingers. And you give that option for expert users and allow novice users to get it just visually. Aesthetic and minimalist design. Dialogue should not contain unnecessary or contain information which is irrelevant or rarely used. There's another seat up front here. Right here.
Go right here.
Every extra unit of information in a dialogue competes with the relevant units of information and diminishes relative visibility. This goes back to that quote that I put up there at the beginning of the session. Just take stuff out and see if it works. If you need to put stuff back in, fine, but take it out. Take it out first. Help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. Error messages should be expressed in plain language, no codes, precisely indicate the problem, and constructively suggest a solution. Now, this really goes back to also knowing your audience. A classic case of this is the 404 error in a website. Most people are not so steeped in the web experience that they understand what 404 means. I know what 404 means, but most people don't. If you get to a 404 page, it shouldn't say 404 error. It should say this page does not exist. Something speaking to humans terms, and then show them how to get back. And then lastly, help and documentation. Even though it is better if the system can be used without documentation, it may be necessary to provide help and documentation anyway. Any such information should be easy to search, focused on the user's task, list concrete steps to be carried out, and not be too large. So you don't have to put help on every screen, but make it quickly available. Yes.
So out of that list, are there certain ones that Rain focuses on in terms of their value add, that more than others, or what's the spread right now? Pretty good.
What I'd like to do is having a pretty good understanding of each of these things. I try to instill in the designers just all of them, being aware of them. I think, you know, the instructional or the visual designers really focus on this idea of aesthetic, and as the user experience design, if we see too much text or things like that, then we say rip it out. It's hard to say if there's any other real, because a lot of these things will end up actually coming down to who's designing that aspect of the product. Because when Dr. Gibbons' talk was about layers, it's pretty realistic that there's somebody designing the database layer, and there's someone designing the interface layer, someone designing the HTML at the front, the user experience designing sort of the experience process, and then copywriters writing down the language. And so for each of those areas, there are certain things that are more important, like providing error prevention. Almost always at Brain ends up being where the developers need to pay attention, because they are the ones who actually code that up. We don't have the time necessarily, being an agency environment, to outline each step in any given process, so we have to rely heavily on them to make those choices. So I wouldn't say that any one weighs heavier than others, but does that answer your question enough? You know, it doesn't.
Is there one of your favorites, one you don't like to, are there times when you're trying to convince somebody, hey, we need to have recognition instead of recall, and they just don't listen? Are there pet peeves that you have? Are there?
I think this one's the biggest one for me.
Okay.
Making sure that things are distilled down and not getting overboard. And then I think this one probably is the other thing that falls under what my thought process is. I don't ever say this heuristic, but the idea for me is people aren't going to understand this because it's not part of their everyday experience. It doesn't make sense out of context of the user, of the developer's head, you know, that sort of thing. So yeah, that'd probably be my two favorites. So we can design, but most of us, we can only give it our best effort, or the best stab at it. And so for me, this is the really important part of user experience design and the design process in general, is that you have to see someone, you have to watch somebody do this. A quote from Steve Krug, who wrote Don't Make Me Think, and another book called Rocket Surgery Made Easy. He's a website usability consultant, and his books are great. I highly recommend those. But he said, even though terms like user-centered design and user experience are now in the vocabulary of most people working on websites, relatively few designers, developers, stakeholders, managers, and check signers, who all have a hand in the design process, have actually spent any time watching how people use websites. As a result, we end up designing for our abstract idea of users based on the most part on ourselves. So as you're in the process of actually observing users and watching them, you get a better sense of why those heuristics matter, and so you're able to design a little bit better initially. But almost every time we create something, there's going to be issues that we don't perceive in how the users do. So the way we do it at Rain is we get 5 to 7 users, and we just sit down with them. We put them in front of their computer, or we have a little camera device that sits on a sled that you can put a mobile device on, and it records it, and we save it using an Adobe Connect room, so we share it. And Adobe Connect allows us both to broadcast it to stakeholders who want to observe it while it's happening, and also record it if they want to go back and review it later, or if we do. So the reason that we use 5 to 7 users, when I first got there, they used to use a few more than that. But I found this research by Jacob Nielsen, where he did a number of usability tests, and they were measuring how many usability problems they found. They would get up to 15 users, and there's just this point of diminishing return. So you're spending double the amount of time to get maybe 1 or 2 more usability problems, or 3 usability problems, which in the end, it's just not efficient, not practical from a standpoint of cost versus benefit. So what we do is we'll usually do 5 usability studies. And if one or two of those users are really different from the others, so we're not getting kind of a consistent view of things, then we'll add a couple more to see if maybe we've got some outliers in one side or the other. And usually by doing that process, we're able to find by the time we're done with the 7th user, we're not really seeing anything new. You know, it's not statistically reliable, but from a practical standpoint, it seems to be fitting the bill with what we do. Of course, the important thing with being able to make that call is that you have to find your user. You can't just grab your mom or someone off the street. You have to find the people that your product is aimed at in order to get their actual response. The better you're able to screen out participants for usability studies, the better chance you have of seeing realistic usability problems. So if there's one thing you were to change in your designing process, if you haven't done usability studies, I would recommend it, because a typical usability study for us takes about 60 to 70 agency hours, meaning, you know, the setup, the prep, the recruiting and all that, and then writing up an analysis. And if you're internal, you don't have to write up an analysis. You know, you shave another few days of work. So that's really good. So,
Is this to create a simple wireframe stage where you conduct these, or when it's actually something coded?
we do it at all stages. So I've done it at wireframes. I've done it more of a click-through prototype, and then we've done it on the actual site or product itself. Yeah.
What kind of thought goes through when you're selecting 5 or 7?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, when you're selecting the 5 or 7 to use, what's your thought process in selecting them?
In how you choose who's going to participate. Well, the first thing we have to do is decide. You know, if we're working with a client, say, who are you building this for? Is it the general public? Is it women ages 20 to 35? Is it children? Is it people 10 to 12? You know, whatever those. Theoretically, the client should have already decided this is our market. If they haven't, then it's just a process of trying to work with them to decide that, see if they'll pay for some market research and that sort of thing. But those are the considerations. And so when we're choosing one, if we have a range of like college-age students, then we might call around to the universities around here and just reach out through local networks of our employees. If it's a more discrete kind of group of people, then we've hired a marketing agency to actually do some recruiting for us. It adds to the cost, but then you're actually using their call center outbound calls, we're able to get a much more a better sample. Does that answer your question? Now I want to talk about the create delight aspect of things. User-centered design should guide all our actions. We should be consulting users, watching them in their environment like anthropologists. And as we do that, we are more apt to recognize where the problems are and start designing to solve those problems. But when we begin to design, sometimes we fall into the trap of using the wrong mental model. So I wanted to talk about what's delightful. Is this delightful? This is the idea of the mental model. The mental model is how you think a system works. And the developer knows very intimately how a system works. So just as a very simple example of this process, to draw a line between 2 points on a computer, the computer has to set an initial x coordinate, has to set a y coordinate for the initial point. Then it has to set an n coordinate of x and y. And then a variable of line width, perhaps, line color, things like that. So then you tell the computer, draw a line between these 2 coordinates. The developer is thinking about this from that standpoint, says, set an initial x coordinate, set an initial y coordinate. And you're dealing in numbers and text boxes and things, and then you hit execute and it draws the line. This is thinking in the actual computer mental model. Whereas a designer who wants to draw a line just wants to click a point, and the line is drawn. And that's the paradigm. So we have the user's paradigm, which is I want to draw a line. I don't want to enter points because it's a different mental model. This is a very simplistic example, but this gap between what a user wants to do and what the tool allows them to do is called by cognitive scientists the gulf of execution. And if you ever want to read a really great book about the cognitive science behind usability and user experience, Jeffrey Johnson, I think his first name is Jeffrey, but Designing with the Mind in Mind is a really good book. Anyway, this gap of execution draws the user's attention away from the objective that they have and into the tool and trying to deal with the tool rather than their objective. And so that goal of our interface design should be to minimize that gap so we don't have to have them fiddling around within the application in order to accomplish what it is they want to accomplish. So when we minimize the gulf of execution, it almost automatically creates a sense of delight. So here's just a really kind of bizarre example that I hope sort of stir your minds in a new direction. Earlier on, I think it was last year, I had read about standing desks and how they could be more healthy for you. And I read up that there was this easy way to make one at your house by setting up this table into your wall, screwing it and stuff. So I did that at my house. I built this standing desk about this high, just in my home office. And it was funny because after I did that, every day I came home from, I was pretty full-time in school at that point. I'd come home, I had homework to do, I walked into the office and I just actually feel delighted. I would feel happy because I could just stand up and start working. I didn't have to sit down. I don't know what that was, but just the fact that everything was there ready for me at this level, like just walk in and start working, actually created this sense of joy when I came into my office. It doesn't as much anymore as when it first did, but in reality, that may be because I set up a standing desk at work too, so I'm standing all the time. At any rate, so the idea of creating something where you're minimizing the amount of work, I think automatically will create a person's happiness, that I am able to accomplish what I want to accomplish and nothing's interfering with that. I'm straight in there, I'm doing what I need to do, and then I can get out and I can get on with my life. So this is this product I use, which I really recommend if you're going to do usability studies on prototypes, things like that. This is a really great application that's web-based, and I believe that it still has a free account that you can use. I create one project, and so as a student, you're doing that one at a time if you're making a product. So what it allows you to do is to upload JPEGs or PNG files, and then click through them. To click through prototype, you can make hotspots on it. And it's really useful. So I wanted to illustrate something about this process of reducing the gulf of execution. Typically when we upload screens in most applications, although it's getting to be less so now, when you click it, it opens up a dialog box, you search through your directory, you click on your file that you want, and you hit upload, and it uploads it. So that's pretty typical. These guys created this drag and drop feature where if you got your files ready, you just drag them all, from your desktop, just drop them into this area right here, it automatically starts uploading for you. It's reducing that step in the process. But then, after a while, they took this one step further, and they created this, and I wasn't able to grab a screenshot because my computer's not up to date, my home computer, my work computer, I have this. But it's like Dropbox. For those of you who use Dropbox or something similar to Box, you just have a file that's synced to the cloud somewhere, and then whenever you add a folder, it adds it to Dropbox, and then whenever you open up your other computer that has Dropbox on it, the files are there for you. So they do the same thing. So as a designer, I create my PNG files, and I save them to the directory that they're in. It's automatically uploaded, and the name of the file, if it stays the same, will automatically overwrite the file that's in the system up there. So all of the hot spots stay the same. And just by creating my change in Illustrator or Photoshop, then I hit save to the PNG file, it automatically updates. So the next time my clients go to InVision, they're seeing the most updated version. So that's the process that I think about when we're trying to reduce this gap of execution. This is what I felt was like a good example of that. So lastly, I want to talk about the idea of surprise. because there's this idea of just being able to get in and do something and it's good, and that creates a sense of delight. But there's also this sense that we get as human beings when something is different from normal but cool, that creates a sense of delight. One of my best examples, I always bring Calvin and Hobbes into things. Just Bill Watterson, it was his stated objective to surprise readers every day. That was his goal, and I think that is one of the reasons, because he made that his goal, he was able to be so successful. He wasn't willing to just put out a comic strip that was the same old joke that people have heard before, which a lot of times, for those of you who read comic strips in newspapers, it's the same thing. So what he would do was, he had created this world, he had created characters who were always consistent. We knew what Calvin was. He was mischievous but also vulnerable. We had Hobbes, who is a smart aleck but also understanding and patient. We had his parents who were very prototypical type parents, frustrated with the activity of their son. But within that, we were able to create delight. This is a surprise for readers. They see these characters that are not typical of Calvin and Hobbes. And it's this kind of bizarre interaction, especially this one. A baby, I don't want a baby. What shall we name him? Our baby is a rabbit? How can we have a rabbit? It just gets more bizarre, but then at the end, it's Calvin and Susie again. And we understand the context because, oh, he's got this great imagination, we know that. So whenever Calvin had this imagination, it all fit into his persona, we understood him. That should be really our objective, is we create a design, is to create this self-consistent world. Dr. Swan works at the CTL, taught, his dissertation was about this idea of how we can create engagement in people, using game design as a foundation for trying to distill out these things. One of the things that he said is a self-consistent setting helps engage people. When we create our system, we can create a consistent setting and then add things to it that create a sense of surprise but also delight. But by keeping it within that context, we're not making it disconcerting or confusing. So using existing paradigms to provide the foundation for your work is an important thing. Sometimes, I mentioned before, creativity, we sometimes want to create something that's never been done before. Creativity, when it's done that way, can be disconcerting and hard to create adoption by design. So if you're aiming to introduce some new concept, it better be good if you're going to go outside of the context so people understand. Whereas innovation, in my opinion, is the process of creativity that actually embraces the context and lives within a specified restriction. And by doing that, is able to incrementally move forward, like they did with that Envision app. Created a lot easier, a new experience for me, but it was within a consistent setting. So in summary, user experience design covers a lot of ground. Information architecture, human-computer interface, interaction design, all of these things sort of fall into this umbrella of user experience. But if you think about those heuristics and some of those established principles of the interface design, you can design good interfaces that don't interfere with people achieving what they want to do. But by really digging in and understanding your users and realizing the world they're in, you're able to create delight and an understanding of their mental model allows you to design something that makes sense to them and much, much better. So I have a list of recommended reading that a lot of these ideas have come from. If you want, I'll have a piece of paper, you can give me your email and I'll send you this list of recommended reading. But that's my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? John?
What percentage of your work is the creative versus percentages, the incremental innovation work that you guys do? Half and half?
I think, if I understand your question, is how much do I get to actually create new things? I'd say it's not often, because most of our clients aren't willing to go out expand beyond where they want to be. Most of my work ends up trying to keep it within the context that exists. I've done a few projects where I felt like I've been able to really push the boundaries a little bit, but it's not as often as I would hope.
Which is a reflection of the client's needs and
Right.
where they want to go and that kind of thing.
Because right now, RAIN is especially ended up being a second level. So there's a creative agency, and then RAIN is sort of hired as the development shop. And so we end up having to negotiate our ideas through a second party. It always is harder to do than we like.
Could you maybe just diagram even the typical project workflow and kind of how you fit into that?
Yeah. Maybe.
Let's see.
So we will get a project from a client. They'll send an RFP, request for proposal. So my department gets involved at this point, usually most projects. And more often than not, this RFP is too vague for us to be able to estimate against. So they're saying, we want to be able to build this. How much is it going to cost? The design estimation process is horrendously hard to do. So what we've ended up doing is we write user stories at this point. So either one or another of my employees or myself will write user stories. Basically, we can take their RFP, we try to understand and fill in the blanks of the holes that they have in their request for proposal. We know the basic objective they want, but at this point, nobody's paying us to do anything. So we do a quick best effort at trying to explain to them what they want and then estimate against that explanation. So the user stories get put into a proposal and we give them a dollar amount. And then they say, okay, go ahead and launch this project, we're going to do it. So at that point, ideally we've rolled into a discovery process into it because we say, you're very vague, this is our best guess, but we really need to do some interviewing, we really need to do some observation and that sort of thing. So we'll get maybe a 2-week process where my team gets going and do stakeholder interviews and user interviews of people, competitive reviews necessary, understanding. If it's a website, we'll often do a content audit as well, where we're going through, and if it's a website, we have to understand what's on the website. If we're redesigning it, we need to know. And so we need to know who owns each content, and then we can make our recommendations based on that. So after this discovery process, and sometimes built into it, but sometimes separate from it, would be wireframes. And this comes along with our sort of strategy recommendation. So we take all that we've learned from our user experience, we'll write up a recommendation, we'll accompany it with wireframes. So if it's a website, we'll give them a navigation structure and page structure, template recommendations. If it's a mobile app, we'll give them a user flow diagram that walks through what we call the happy path, or what the most likely user scenario is going to be that we would build around, and then some ancillary scenarios that might be important as well. So wireframe strategy, user flow, and then at this point we've been getting our visual designers more in the wireframe stage, so that they can actually be making the wireframes because they have better speed on their computers than sometimes our user experience designers do. But in the process, we've had a couple of meetings, brainstorms, ideas in order to create this wireframe idea. So the wireframes are built, strategy and user flow. And after that, we turn it over to our designers, our visual designers, who go through and sometimes in this discovery strategy, they're also doing a look and feel type of process where they compare with other sites. What do you want your site to look like? What's the voice? What's the imagery? What's the color scheme? Things like that. So they're doing that during the discovery process. And once design comes up, we have approval of wireframes, and so at the design stage, they do mock-ups, and so it's realistic mock-ups of usually if it's a website, it's usually the homepage, and if there are other pages that didn't make sense to do mock-ups of. And at any stage between here and here, I try to sell them on a usability study. To say, we're doing our best guess. What can you give us some money so we can do this usability study? Five people, it's only going to be $3,000-4,000, something like that. By doing that, we're able to catch things early. That's my recommendation. But a lot of times, the people aren't willing to put forth the money, which is sad, but money talks. So at that point, we try to do a usability study if we can, either at the wireframe stage or do a click-through prototype with the mock-ups. Then at that point, we'll do a usability review, heuristic review, just going over the site to see if there's anything that in the design that violates some of those main basic principles. And if there is, we make recommendations. And our objective is always not to just call attention to problems, but to create solutions. And so we won't just say, hey, this is bad, figure it out. We will say, hey, this is bad, try this or this, and see what you get. And at that point, the design usually gets done and finished, and the finished product is released. And I guess I should mention that the developers, at the same time we're doing discovery, are doing a technical discovery. And so our objective is to work with the developers as well to understand what technology they're using, to see if there's limitations to it. If they're using Drupal as their foundation, then, or their Drupal restrictions, if they're using .NET, or if it's a mobile app, if it's iOS, there's interactions that iOS and Android have differently that don't function the same. And in light of that, when we write user stories, we're trying to write them for Apple platform as well. So that's the basic process. As design is being created, the developers are developing at the same time in tandem. We have sort of a waterfall / lean process. We do scrums every morning with our developers. Sometimes the designers are there, sometimes they're not. Sometimes UX gets there, sometimes we don't, just because of staffing issues. But because most people aren't willing to put any money into anything until it's fully fleshed out, we almost have to do the full documentation process at the front. Although, as much as we can, we try to tell people, try to set up a retainer kind of relationship where they can we can iterate back and forth with them, so that we don't have to do all this up front. We give them a lower rate so that they'll just go hourly with us, and it saves problems. It helps us design better. But anyway, that's the process. Is that useful?
That was really useful. Do you often you get to iterate? I mean, it's like the iteration of both the client and even with like the usability studies and kind of like that slowly refining your product, because it doesn't seem like that diagram doesn't look like that's a huge part of it.
The iteration. Typically, in an agency environment, we don't have the luxury of very many iterations. So at the iteration stage, this wireframes, this is usually where the most iteration happens. So we usually give them like 3 feedback cycle. So we'll feed them the initial wireframes, and then do a cycle here.
And that's what you get the feedback from the clients.
So yeah, so we present our first stunt. They say, hey, we don't like this, we like this, and then we give them a new wireframe based on that. So the iteration happens here at wireframes, and then usually there's probably 1 design iteration, maybe 2, the look and feel. So during the discovery, they'll go through, present like 3 mood boards, they call them. This idea of 3 different approaches to the design, look and feel, and then we walk through that process. And then they can iterate on that if necessary. Clients are notoriously finicky on the last details. So a lot of agencies will say, we only have 2 iterations. We don't have time to do more, otherwise it's a change order. You have to go through that process. So we've been bad about that in the past, but we're getting better at just saying, you know, we can only do so much in the time that you've given us. If they want to take more time, then yeah, we'll do more iteration, but they have to pay. So, any other questions? I don't know what time it's getting to be. Oh, it's 10:50 already. So, we probably don't have time to do any sort of hands-on stuff. Yeah, but I'm willing to stay for another 20 minutes or so. I know the devotional is happening next. If you want question, answers, anything. Was devotional canceled?
There's a forum.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyways,
Somebody can check in on that.
Tuesday's form address canceled. Run with it.
What would the thing, what would you have planned for the practice thing?
So what I was going to do is divide you into groups. There's a bigger group than I had anticipated. Just work on 3 scenarios. If you guys want to try that, do that. Okay. So what my objective was to have you work in groups of 3 or so people, and I'll give you a specific scenario to design against. Basically, it would just be paper prototyping, 3 different scenarios. So is everybody going to sit in